For this video, I will be discussing the effectiveness of soft power against terrorism. In the first section of this paper, I go over how we use soft power against today's adversaries. So after the events of 9/11, the U.S. quickly found out that it did not possess the necessary public diplomacy capabilities needed to meet the national security threat at that time. The strategy of public diplomacy during the Cold War was no longer applicable to current adversaries. However, many argue that the public diplomacy, it has potential to help win the current war on terror. By promoting national interest through informing, engaging, and influencing people around the world, it could help get rid of much of the anti-American sentiments that are present amongst many nations worldwide. Although hard power and a militaristic approach are definitely options to consider when combating non-state actors, this paper definitely looks at how soft power's role affects increasing cooperation amongst these adversaries that we're facing today. One of the many faults that scholars point out is that the fact that U.S. policy and interests are largely misunderstood by our allies and very misrepresented by our adversaries. This could be resolved by an effective public diplomacy approach, but the U.S. has instead almost done the opposite. Government officials have even noted the reform for public diplomacy strategies. However, there's a lack of sustenance, which allows for negative results. Others argue that hard power and military force and other coercive measures are our only bet, but there's been an overdependence on this hard power that we've seen throughout the global war on terror. Scholar Michael Wadsworth notes that because the U.S. has done very little to define itself in the Middle East, and the government has done little for itself in terms of responding effectively or ensuring our interests are understood correctly, it attributes to that anti-American sentiment that there's very little being done. Then, of course, there are those that argue that the U.S. approaches to public diplomacy directly complement efforts to counter violent extremism. However, those that do argue this note that there is no straight cause and effect line that actually determines this, but opinion studies show promising things. This brings us to the question of if soft power is actually effective as a strategic deterrent. Most are stuck in defining deterrence as what it was during the Cold War. However, the current situation calls for a different type of deterrence. The adversaries that once were during the Cold War no longer exist. However, it is noted that current adversaries are deterred more if their political goals are placed at risk, not necessarily their lives. So the next section of the paper, it goes over current policy regarding diplomacy. So it's obviously no secret that times are changing. While the U.S. has long been regarded as the superpower of the world, we are now seeing that there's a greater focus on diplomatic approaches to build relationships and working partnerships with other nations worldwide. In the late 1990s, there were concerns over the ineffectiveness of the U.S. diplomatic infrastructures. The State Department even reported that the U.S.'s presence abroad was near a state of crisis and close to the point of system failure. Also during this time, Congress decided to reorganize the foreign policy apparatus by removing some agencies and attempting to merge those functions into the State Department. However, the State Department was not prepared to absorb these functions. And this is what many attribute to the decrease in positive image and influence of the U.S. abroad. There's also a continued lack of investment and resources provided to U.S. public diplomacy. However, in 2006, we saw that then Secretary Rice noted her vision for more transformational diplomacy. The objective of this type of diplomacy was to work with partners around the world to build and sustain democratic, well-governed states that would respond to the needs of their people and conduct themselves responsibly in the international system. Although this sounds like a step in the right direction, there are organizational and structural complications which continue to inhibit the full enactment of this plan. Much like what happened in the late 90s, there's a lack of investment and resources that has inhibited diplomacy from being executed effectively. As I stated previously, there are many that believe hard power is our only option. Joseph Nye argues that while U.S. the U.S. does have an impressive operational capacity, U.S. diplomacy and foreign assistance programs are almost always underfunded and neglected. He attributes this to the difficulty of demonstrating short-term impact on critical changes. With that said, still relying on hard power with no real policy that encompasses both hard power approaches and soft power approaches, it really only hinders the attempts of U.S. diplomacy abroad. Not only having the ability to attract others through legitimacy of U.S. policy and values, not having the ability to attract others through legitimacy of U.S. policies and values, it does nothing to help achieve U.S. goals. If we continue to ignore this declining image abroad and not take any action to promote its attractiveness, we will experience a rise in enemies and disdain to the U.S. worldwide. Hard power and a pure militaristic approach does not help to eradicate long-term issues. Although a soft power approach may not necessarily be attractive to most Americans, not worrying why countries abroad hate us is becoming more and more important to American citizens as well. So the next section of this paper goes over how other nations cope with these terrorist groups or adversaries within their borders. So the U.S. maintains a hard stance on refraining from negotiating with terrorist organizations. However, this does not mean that we refrain completely from interacting or aiding nations which frequently cooperate with these terrorist organizations. Nations such as Yemen, Nigeria, and Pakistan all have ties with the U.S., and all three frequently interact with different terrorist organizations within their borders. So how these nations interact with these groups also affects their relationships with the U.S. So first we're going to look at Yemen. With the recent resignation of Yemen President Abed Rabo Hadi, the fears of the Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, or AQAP, obtaining control of the nation seem to be coming true. So without going into too much background detail, the AQAP have posed a threat in Yemen since the late 90s and early 2000s. While the Yemen government allowed Al-Qaeda to operate liberally during this time, it was not until after 9/11 that the Yemen government really offered their cooperation and support to the U.S. in the global war on terror, hoping in the back of their minds to keep them from becoming targets like Afghanistan did. So while working with the U.S., the Yemen government and military were successful in dismantling Al-Qaeda, the Al-Qaeda leadership in Yemen in 2003. So it was really at this time that they considered the counterterrorism mission complete and focused the attention elsewhere. However, as we've seen, the AQAP has resurfaced in Yemen. Scholars really attribute this resurfacing to three external factors. So the Iraqi war, the 2006 jailbreak in Sana'a, and the Saudis' counterinsurgency efforts, which really aggressively pushed out Al-Qaeda into exile. So although there were a series of U.S. airstrikes, this, along with the Yemeni military offenses, have really done nothing but fuel the AQAP's attempts to gain population approval in the region. The next nation that we'll look at is Pakistan. As we know, Pakistan enjoys its title as one of the top-ranking recipients of U.S. military and security funding within the world. However, it also accounts for approximately 20% of the terrorist groups that are on the State Department's terrorist organization list. Most of us are aware that the growing presence of militant Islamic groups, specifically the Taliban, brings about speculations that some members of the Pakistani government are complicit to the existence of these select groups. Although Pakistan has claimed its support in the global war on terror, it has taken them a while to approve functional policies. It wasn't until 2012 that the Pakistani government approved the National Counterterrorism Authority Act, and in this act it assisted in improving counterterrorism organizations and any information sharing between the security agencies and police. In 2013, Pakistan passed the National Counterterrorism Authority Bill, which provided for the establishment of a national authority to devise counterterrorism strategy and to help integrate and coordinate counterterrorism efforts among various agencies within the country. So while these passings of these legislations proves to be a step in the right direction, It's somewhat questionable as to why they waited over a decade of war and significant casualties to civilian and security forces to implement this law when they could have done it much, much sooner. And the U.S. probably would have helped them much, much sooner as well. The last nation discussed in this section, one that's been receiving a lot of media attention lately, is Nigeria and the Boko Haram. So I found that it's noted that Boko Haram sought to create a better Nigeria through the strict adherence to Islam. However, over time, the group's members saw themselves increasingly at odds with the secular authorities, whom they came to view as representatives of a corrupt, illegitimate, Christian-dominated federal government. Nigeria has found itself combating Boko Haram with force. They conduct routine police searches and deploy Nigerian military forces to go out and seek these members of the terrorist group. However, the Nigerian government is learning that their traditional methods of kill and capture, counterterrorism strategy doesn't always prove successful. There's also a huge lack of trust and cooperation from local population to aid in any of these counterterrorism efforts against Boko Haram. There's also a huge distrust towards the government and the police and military among local citizens. So this illegitimacy of the Nigerian government and security forces has really fueled an enabling environment for Boko Haram to successfully recruit and remain within the country. The next section of my paper goes over what policies actually work when combating these types of adversaries. So as seen as in the cases of Yemen, Pakistan, and Nigeria, these nations, which really have the unfortunate responsibility of housing terrorist groups, more often than not lose the battle of maintaining power within their country. So my question is, what exactly is the best method to combating these groups? Is it strictly hard power approach and military? Does it need to be strictly diplomatic, or do we need a mixture of both? A happy medium. A lot of scholars I found advocate a smart power, or the combining of both hard power and soft power in ways that are mutually reinforcing, such that the actor's purposes are advanced effectively and efficiently. Scholar Ernest Wilson notes smart power needs a smart campaign. So this basically means that policy officials must reframe hard power and soft power to demonstrate the positives of each and expose how they can be more intelligently incorporated and balanced in the strategy and demeanor of American foreign policy. Then there are those who completely go against the grain and argue that soft power is completely ineffective and cannot be considered a substantial alternative to hard power, hard military power. While that's definitely an extreme approach to it, there are others who believe that public diplomacy collaboration between nations and non-state actors is most likely more flexible and result-oriented than nations and official non-state actors working independently. So while at one point in time hard power may have outweighed the benefits or outcomes of soft power, or vice versa, today's world really requires a more sound and collaborated method when dealing with these types of savage groups that make up modern security conflicts. I argue that diplomatic measures may not be effective when dealing with terrorists. However, it could prove effective when dealing with the nations that unwillingly harbor these groups. So the very last section of this paper is what I believe policy should look like going forward. There's definitely a call for a more soft power and democratic approach to situations involving these terrorists. It's become more and more of an important topic of discussion, pretty much worldwide. Most aspects of American society, to include administration, Congress, the public, we're all very torn between different approaches when dealing with the new challenges faced after 9/11. While it can be said that the U.S. has been more successful in its dealings with hard power, this is most likely due to the fact that there's been more investment and training implemented into this approach. There's definitely been less success in the areas of soft power and diplomacy due to its lack of investment, the neglect of institutions, and inadequate public diplomacy. In turn, this has allowed for a sense of illegitimacy of the U.S. and has really hindered American attractiveness worldwide. Initial policy after 9/11 really focused on preemptive attacks on terrorist organizations. This in turn caused many to question this method, as it allows for a lot of collateral damage and potentially the death of many innocent civilians. However, it does allow for the eradication and discouragement of specific organizations. It could also serve as a political statement too. Scholar Robert Cooper notes that if you want to exercise soft power, you must have something to offer, kind of like a recipe for success. You need resources to help others get there, and probably armed forces to protect them on the way. So essentially, a nation cannot have one without the other, being hard power or soft power. With the ever-evolving scheme of things, legitimacy or soft power is required, as is hard power to reaffirm that legitimacy if needed. As a superpower, the U.S. has a reputation to uphold, which we all are aware of. We're a major promoter of democracy and human rights across the world, and we're the world's leading military power. That being said, the U.S. must effectively incorporate its soft power and hard power within one another. Past and present approaches to combating terrorism and the threat that arises from it have proven to need some modification. So since the events of 9/11, we've found that we're underestimating and undervaluing our diplomatic methods to combat the enemy. Had we incorporated more of a diplomatic approach in the beginning, it may have led to different outcomes, but of course this is all in hindsight. We're going on over a decade, much more over a decade of this war, and there's still some reform changes needed to our policies. So I think by taking a closer look at a more diplomatic approach, while still maintaining that military power and hard power if needed, will be our best bet in combating these individuals and helping these nations which harbor them to really come to and be able to combat them successfully and maintain stability within their walls. So that's all I have for this paper. I hope you have a great day. Thanks.